I'm forever indebted to whoever brought this step stool. Very helpful. Okay, hello, my name is Hannah. This is my project, The Philosophy of Grief. To philosophize is to learn to live. I want to give a brief content warning in case you didn't read the title. This is about grief and death, which I know are heavy subjects, so if you need to step out, take a minute, totally okay. I also want to give a shout out to my advisor who asked me not to give him a shout out, but Dr. Matthew Parfit, thank you for your patience and your diligence. Also, thank you to my family and friends and my mom. Hi, hope you worked out the live stream. Hope you're here. Okay, I have to lean down. This is new for me. Okay, so I want to begin with a story. Let me take you back to 399 BCE in ancient Greece in the Republic and the Phaedo. These are works written by Plato as an account of the philosopher Socrates. Now, there's a lot of context here, not enough time to give it to you, but essentially Socrates is being executed. And he drinks a hemlock into all of his family and friends who are lamenting and weeping. He says so profoundly, quote, "What conduct is this, you strange men? I sent the women away chiefly for this reason, so they might not behave in this absurd way." Which when I read that, I was like, wow, okay. So interesting insights there. He essentially upbraids his friends and calls grief absurd and irrational. Now, this is the sad part, I'm sorry. Fast forward to 2023, this is my story and how this project impacts me. Loss has been a big part of my life, unfortunately, this last year. Last year, I lost my maternal grandmother to cancer, and about 3 weeks later, my father to a quite unexpected heart attack. I was abroad in London when my father died, so I read that quote from Socrates on my plane back. Which, I'm sure you can imagine, it did not sit well with me, thus the motivation for this project and why I looked into the philosophy of grief. Okay, so Socrates goes on to say that any good man is, quote, least likely to lament in the face of grief. Of course, he doesn't talk about women, but whatever. There's also a lot of philosophers here. I read a lot more than this, but there's just a few. Across thousands of years, many disciplines who have a similar view. They view grief as irrational, and generally speaking, philosophy has an antipathy to grief. Now, my project is a series of 4 essays. I'll talk more about that later. They ask and answer a lot of questions about grief, but namely 1, why is this intuition wrong? And 2, how, if at all, can philosophy help us grieve well? So there's a lot to this. First, I think it's vital to understand a bit about grief's foundations of who do we grieve for. I think it's vital now to mention this work by Dr. Michael Colby, Grief, A Philosophical Guide. Now, I started this presentation with a quote from 399 BCE. This book is one of the first books ever published solely on the topic of grief and philosophy, and it was published in 2022. So clearly it's taken us quite a bit of time to get here. And thanks to the generosity of Kilachand, I got to travel all the way to the University of Edinburgh and meet Dr. Colby. I, of course, forgot to take a photo with him, so those are some other photos. I got to share my project with him, and I also got to interview him. So given that I traveled literally thousands of miles, I'd love to play a bit of that interview for you. Here's his response to the question of who do we grieve for? I really hope this works, guys.
I suppose the one thing that lots of philosophers have said by way of initial reaction to my own thinking on grief is that many of them want to claim that the object of grief experience is the death of someone else, the world's loss, right, by virtue of someone's death. But as I always point out, right, this doesn't really seem to explain the obvious fact about grief, which is that we don't grieve every death. We grieve those in whom we've invested our practical identities. Well, we can invest our practical identities in people in lots of different ways.
So the most important part of that segment was the idea of practical identity, which is posed by philosopher and psychologist Christine Korsgaard. Essentially, practical identity is our perception of ourselves based on the things we invest ourselves in. So that could be religion, profession, but by far, it's the most notable relationships in our lives. So this makes grief really multifaceted. Colby says that we grieve to the extent that we invest our practical identities into others. So in this, grief responds to both external and internal loss. It's a reconciliation of both the physical loss of a person and also a loss of our own personal identity. So in this, grief is entirely rational and even a necessary response to the multifaceted nature of grief. Okay, next question. Is it possible to grieve well? So essentially, he says that in grief, we come to cultivate self-knowledge, which is the crux of my project. Essentially, we grieve for those we invest our practical identities into, and then that we come to face and reconcile aspects of ourselves that were once dependent on someone no longer with us. So in that, we cultivate self-knowledge and also self-sufficiency. So there is something tangible to gain from grief. Now, a lot of philosophers, from Socrates to Kant, say that we actually have a duty to know ourselves to the best of our ability because no one knows us the way that we do. So in that sense, there's a philosophical duty to grieve. I love this. Kolbe says that grief is also an act of self-love because in grief we come to reflect on the aspects of those we lost that we love, and we try to fill in those gaps for ourselves. I will wrap this up in a pretty bow by saying that what philosophy means is to make sense of the world around us, to ask hard questions and come face to face with hard answers. And so grieving really is the epitome of what it means to philosophize. And every philosopher for the last thousands of years before me got it wrong. So I said it first. I really want to throw this in here. After my interview with Dr. Kolbe, I had some free time. I was in Scotland. I had no idea where I was, and I went on a walk, and I stumbled upon this at a creek, and it says, "Grief is not forever, but love is." So I love that. Okay, so here's the QR code to my finished essays if anyone wants to read them. The first one is "To philosophize is to learn to live," which is a play on Montaigne's most famous essay, "To philosophize is to learn to die." Essentially, when we grieve, we come face to face with death and the prospect of our own deaths. This essay is about how to internalize that into a more fulfilled life. Then we have "The Philosophy of Grief," which follows the outline of this presentation, essentially a history on the philosophy of grief and channeling that into self-knowledge. Then we have my interview with Dr. Kolbe, and you can actually see it and not with the technical difficulties. And then we have an essay on recollection, how to situate memory of the deceased, not solely in the past, but also in the present. Okay, I'd like to end with just a few notes about the people who inspired this project. That's my dad, and that's my grandma. I am so proud of myself for being able to channel the pain I felt this last year into something productive. I have presented this at Harvard. I presented it at a bunch of different conferences. I've had so many beautiful conversations with family, friends, strangers about their loss and their grief. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's the importance of talking about that more candidly. The only reason I have the strength to ask these questions and to get up here and present on this in front of you is because of my grandma and my dad. So to me, through this project, they are both very, very much alive. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, Hannah.
Hey, girl.
I wanted to thank you for being so willing to share this part of your life with us. And I noticed that you mentioned a lot of male philosophers, and I was wondering if you could speak to what it means to be a woman in the field of philosophy.
Cool, girl. Well, you know what? A crucial part of my project is feminism and grief, because a lot of these male philosophers will call grief emotional through a feminine lens, like how Socrates said that should be left only to the women. So it's an interesting role to play of having to compartmentalize that and take, half of what a philosopher says for good faith and the other half being this is sexist, So it's very difficult. And Martha Nussbaum and a couple of other more modern female philosophers do play aspects in my project. So y'all should read the essays. And I talk about the women there.
Hi, thank you for this. So you mentioned that, along the lines of the traditional discipline of philosophy, this has definitely been a missed subject for a long time. Mm-hmm. But I'm curious if you looked at all outside the scope of what is, the small sliver that is actually labeled as philosophy, other cultural practices, other processes of grief that exist and very much are philosophy. And if so, where do you see those joining together with the more traditional line?
Totally. So when I first mentioned this project to Dr. Parfit, we had a conversation about like religion and psychology and kind of like tangential, things to philosophy. And I chose to stick just with this because there is a lot to say in a lot of different disciplines, and I only had so much time and so much bandwidth. Psychology kind of fits itself into here a bit, like with the practical identity bit. But I'd like to keep doing this after graduation, and that's something I want to do, expand a bit beyond just the philosophy I mentioned here.
Hi, Hannah.
Hey.
Thanks for your presentation. It was very interesting, and again, I want to applaud you for what you noted on turning your strength out in something that was so painful. I just want to, yay, awesome, amazing. My question is, how would you apply the concept of grief being an act of self-love to a relationship that was perhaps tumultuous and more so leaning towards derogatory? Yeah, that's my.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I think a lot of times when we grieve people who we knew so well that part of our identity is in them, you get to know the good and the bad of people. I'm sure you guys have tumultuous relationships with your parents, I'm sure. So that is a part of grief. And I think grief is so complex because it reflects the complexity of that relationship and that emotion. We don't grieve people we hardly know because we don't really have those layers there. So I think it's about just embracing that, letting yourself feel it, and as time moves on, the good emotions tend to prevail there. At least that's my experience. So.
Hey, girl.
Hey.
Phenomenal presentation. I think I absolutely love the way that you've put this topic, and one of my closest friends and I have always said that grief and love are sometimes indistinguishable and you're even one and the same at times, and I think that is something that you completely captured with your presentation. But my question for you was kind of on a similar line of how the idea that we have a duty to grieve, or there are a lot of expectations surrounding grief even, of people say, oh, I should be more sad, I shouldn't be this sad, or maybe it's been too long since I've been thinking about this. Mm-hmm. So what are your ideas on just the general expectations that we socially have around grief? And if you want to share your own experience just in dealing with that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the entire point is that there shouldn't be any expectations, and that's such a non-answer, but not kind of. Grief reflects the complexity of the relationship that it responds to, like I've said, and no one can really define what that means except for you. The other person in that relationship is no longer there, and in turning grief inwards and letting it be a more egocentric experience, which is kind of what this is about, accepting that grief can be selfish is a very freeing thing, and that's the recommendation that I would give, because that, there's an expectation in grief that it's supposed to be for the person who's deceased, which to an extent it is, but especially in the long run, that person's no longer there, so it's up to you. Grief is for you. So in that sense, it should be up to you what it looks like. Obviously, don't kill people or anything, but rational grief.
Hi, Hannah. Amazing presentation. Very briefly, I have also lost my dad during my time at school, and part of that grief process for me was situating that in other similar experiences of smaller grief that I've experienced in terms of maybe friendships or experiences or grief for events that are not the death of a person. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if either within the scope of this project or just in your own personal life, you have any particular views or thoughts you wanted to share on how grief also exists outside of this solely, person has died, we have to grieve them, for maybe relationships with, or a relationship you had with a person who's still alive, or a relationship to an experience or something like that.
Yeah. That's a great question, and something that came up in my interview with Dr. Colby, actually, so it is a part of my project. I had a very distinct feeling of when these two deaths happened to me. I remember thinking, I have felt this before, even though I've had people in my life pass away, but never someone as close as my grandma or my dad. And I remember being grief is almost like a scale. Having your dad pass away in the way I did is pretty up there, but in breakups, in friendship breakups, I have felt that feeling of grief before. And grief is a response to loss. I think it can respond to any loss. So that's a really, really great point you bring up there. And that in approaching grief through that mindset, it's applicable to a lot more things than people say it is. So, yeah. Thanks.